a Scottish philosopher, died in Edinburgh in August of 1776, the same summer America declared independence. He was 65 years old, ravaged by intestinal cancer, yet reportedly cheerful to the very end. His friends found this unsettling. How could a man who denied the existence of miracles, who questioned the very foundations of religious belief, face death without terror? David Hume's calm departure from life scandalized Christian Europe almost as much as his writings had. Here was proof, his critics said, of either monstrous depravity or extraordinary courage. The truth, as with everything about Hume, was far more interesting than either explanation suggested. This is the story of how a minor Scottish aristocrat's son, too poor to afford university, too stubborn to practice law, became the philosopher who demolished certainty itself. The man who proved we can't even be sure the sun will rise tomorrow, yet somehow remained the most cheerful skeptic who ever lived. David Hume was born on April 26, 1711, though for most of his life he spelled his family name Home, pronounced the same way. The change to Hume came later, an attempt to help English readers pronounce it correctly. He entered the world in Edinburgh, but his childhood unfolded 40 miles south in the Scottish borderlands, a region that had spent centuries as a battlefield between Scotland and England. The family estate was called Nine Wells, named for the 9 springs that bubbled up on the property. It sat in Berwickshire, near the town of Chirnside, surrounded by rolling hills and farmland. This was not wealth, not by aristocratic standards. The Humes were minor gentry, the kind of family that had a name and a history, but not much money to show for it. David's father, Joseph Hume, was a lawyer, not a particularly successful one, but respectable enough. He died when David was 2 years old, leaving behind a widow and 3 children. Catherine Falconer Hume, David's mother, came from a family of lawyers and judges. She was devout, Presbyterian, and by all accounts, strong-willed. She would need to be. Raising 3 children on a limited income in early 18th century Scotland required resourcefulness. The estate passed to David's older brother John, as was the custom. David, as a younger son, would need to make his own way in the world. His sister Catherine would eventually marry and disappear from the historical record, as women of her era typically did. But the family was close, and Ninewells remained David's anchor throughout his life, the place he returned to between adventures, the home that grounded him. Childhood in the borderlands meant exposure to a particular kind of Scottish culture. This was Presbyterian country, shaped by John Knox and the Reformation. Sunday was the Sabbath, observed strictly. Church attendance was not optional. The ministers preached a stern Calvinist doctrine. Humanity was fallen, salvation was predetermined, and God's justice was absolute. Young David absorbed all of this, sitting through long sermons in the cold stone church at Chirnside. He was a quiet child, unusually studious. While his brother John threw himself into the physical life of a country gentleman, hunting and managing the estate, David preferred books. He read everything he could find. The family had a modest library, and David worked through it systematically. History, philosophy, literature, poetry, his mother noticed. She worried, actually. Too much reading, she thought, might damage his health. The concern was not ridiculous by the medical understanding of the time. Excessive study was believed to heat the blood and unbalance the humours. At age 12, David and his brother John were sent to the University of Edinburgh. This was younger than it sounds. Scottish universities in the early 18th century admitted boys in their early teens, offering what was essentially a combination of high school and college education. The curriculum was fixed: Latin, Greek, logic, metaphysics, moral philosophy, and natural philosophy, what we'd now call physics. Edinburgh, in 1723, was Scotland's intellectual capital, a city of perhaps 30,000 people crammed into a medieval warren of tall buildings and narrow closes. The university occupied several buildings near the old town. not yet the grand campus it would later become. Students attended lectures, participated in debates, and were expected to master the works of ancient and modern authors. Hume studied under several professors, though none made a lasting impression on him. The philosophy curriculum was dominated by scholasticism, the medieval synthesis of Aristotle and Christian theology. It was formal, rigid, and to young David's mind, increasingly irrelevant. He was reading other things on his own: Cicero's philosophical works, the French skeptic Pierre Bayle, the Roman poet Virgil. He was beginning to form his own ideas, though he didn't yet know what to do with them. Most students at Edinburgh stayed 3 or 4 years, leaving without a formal degree. This was normal. The university was less about credentials than about education itself. Hume followed the pattern, departing around 1726 without graduating. He was 15 years old, well-read, intellectually restless, and without any clear career path. The obvious choice for a younger son of his background was the law. Scotland's legal system was distinct from England's, based on Roman law and continental principles. It was a respectable profession, potentially lucrative, and it suited men with bookish tendencies. David's uncle and several cousins were lawyers. The family expected him to follow suit. He tried. He genuinely tried. He returned to Ninewells and began reading law under the supervision of family members. Roman law, Scottish legal history, case precedents. The material was dense, technical, and to Hume's mind, crushingly boring. Years later, he would write that he found an insurmountable aversion to everything but the pursuits of philosophy and general learning. That's diplomatic language. The truth was simpler. He hated it. While he was supposed to be studying law, Hume was reading Cicero and Virgil instead. He was working through problems in philosophy, filling notebooks with his own thoughts about human nature, morality, and knowledge. He was, without quite realizing it yet, beginning the project that would consume his life. Then something happened. Hume called it the disease of the learned. Modern scholars have speculated about what this actually meant. Depression, certainly. Nervous breakdown, possibly. Some kind of psychological crisis that manifested in physical symptoms. In 1729, when Hume was 18, his health collapsed. He described the symptoms in a long letter written several years later to a physician: excessive salivation, palpitations of the heart, a general weakness and lassitude. He couldn't concentrate. He couldn't read for more than a few minutes without his mind wandering. The studious, book-obsessed teenager had become an anxious, debilitated young man who could barely function. The medical understanding of the era blamed this on overstudy. Too much intellectual work had overheated his system, unbalancing the 4 humours that governed health. The prescribed treatment was what you'd expect: less studying, more physical activity, a better diet. Hume tried to follow the advice. He forced himself to go on long rides through the countryside. He attempted to engage in the social life of the local gentry, attending gatherings and trying to be convivial. Nothing helped. What was actually happening? We can only speculate. Hume was trapped. He couldn't pursue philosophy openly. There was no career in it, no way to support himself. He was expected to become a lawyer, a profession he despised. The conflict between what he wanted to do and what he was supposed to do created an internal pressure that expressed itself as physical collapse. The body, unable to resolve what the mind could not accept, simply broke down. For 3 years, from roughly 1729 to 1732, Hume struggled. He was neither healthy enough to work nor sick enough to be excused from expectations. He was stuck at Ninewells, watching his brother manage the estate, feeling useless. His mother worried. His relatives made suggestions. Nothing changed. Then Hume made a decision that would have seemed insane to his family if he'd told them the full truth. He decided to become a merchant. In early 1734, now 23 years old, Hume left Scotland for Bristol. England's second largest city and a major trading port. The plan, as far as his family understood it, was to enter the sugar trade. A cousin had connections with a merchant house there. David would learn the business, establish himself in commerce, and finally become financially independent. It lasted 4 months. The merchant's office in Bristol was everything Hume was not. Practical, commercial, focused on profit margins and shipping schedules. He tried. He showed up. He attempted to care about sugar prices and cargo manifests, but he was constitutionally unsuited for business. His mind wandered to philosophy, his notebooks filled with ideas about human understanding, not trade calculations. The breaking point came over a letter. Hume had been asked to write a business correspondence, and he'd done so in his natural style, which was elaborate, eloquent, and completely inappropriate for commercial communication. His employer, exasperated, pointed out that Hume wrote like a man of letters, not a merchant. It was not a compliment. Hume realised something in that moment. He could not pretend anymore. He could not force himself into a mould that didn't fit. If he was going to fail, he might as well fail while doing what he actually cared about. The question was how to manage it. He had no income. He had no position. He had nothing but his mind and an overwhelming desire to write philosophy. The solution came from an unexpected direction. France. France in the 1730s was cheaper than Britain for a young man trying to live on almost nothing. The exchange rate favoured British currency, and living expenses in provincial French towns were a fraction of what they were in London or Edinburgh. If Hume could scrape together enough money, he could live in France for a few years, write his book, and return to Scotland with something to show for his efforts. He had a small inheritance from his father, perhaps £50 a year. Not enough to live on in Britain, but possibly sufficient in France if he was careful. He also had his family's reluctant support. His mother was worried, his brother skeptical, but they didn't stop him. Perhaps they thought he'd get the philosophy obsession out of his system and return ready to be sensible. In 1734, David Hume crossed the English Channel and disappeared into France. He was 23 years old, unknown, unpublished, and about to attempt something audacious. He was going to rewrite philosophy from the ground up. The town he chose was Reims, in the Champagne region, though he wouldn't stay there long. Within months, he moved to La Flèche, a small town in Anjou, about 25 miles from Le Mans. The choice was deliberate. La Flèche was home to a Jesuit college, one of the best educational institutions in France. René Descartes had studied there over a century earlier. The town had a scholarly atmosphere, access to libraries, and most importantly, it was cheap. Hume rented modest lodgings and settled into a routine that would define the next 3 years of his life. He rose early, read, thought, and wrote. He taught himself French, becoming fluent enough to navigate daily life and read philosophical works in the original. He lived frugally, spending almost nothing on entertainment or luxury. Every penny went toward books and basic necessities. What exactly was he writing? A book that would attempt to do for human nature what Isaac Newton had done for physics. Newton had shown that the physical universe operated according to a few simple laws. Gravity explained the motion of planets and the fall of apples. Mathematics described the heavens. What if human nature also operated according to discoverable laws? What if the mind, emotions, morality, and social behaviour could all be explained through careful observation and reasoning? Hume worked on the manuscript obsessively. He revised constantly, throwing out sections and starting over. The ideas were radical, dangerous even. He was arguing that human beings don't have souls in any traditional sense, that morality isn't handed down by God, but emerges from human sentiment, that reason itself is weaker than we imagine. He was dismantling assumptions that had stood for 2,000 years. By 1737, after 3 years in France, Hume had completed a manuscript that terrified him. Not because it was bad, but because he knew what would happen when people read it. He returned to London to find a publisher. The book was massive, sprawling, ambitious beyond anything a 26-year-old nobody had any business attempting. Publishers looked at it and saw commercial suicide. The arguments were too complex, the prose too dense, the conclusions too shocking. One publisher after another turned him down. Finally, John Noon agreed to take it on, but only with conditions. The manuscript had to be cut drastically. Entire sections disappeared. Arguments were condensed. Hume watched his 3 years of work get butchered in the name of marketability. He had no choice. It was this or nothing. In January 1739, the first 2 volumes of A Treatise of Human Nature appeared in London bookshops. The title page carried no author's name, just the words, "by an anonymous author." Hume was too afraid to attach his identity to ideas this radical. The reaction was devastating. Silence. The book didn't provoke outrage or scandal. It provoked nothing at all. Nobody cared. The few reviews that appeared were dismissive or confused. One critic complained that the author seemed to be arguing that we can't know anything for certain, which was absurd on its face. Another suggested the work was clever, but ultimately pointless. Sales were dismal. The publisher lost money. Hume's grand entrance into the philosophical world had flopped completely. He would later write that his book fell dead-born from the press, without reaching such distinction as even to excite a murmur among the zealots. It was worse than being attacked. Being attacked would have meant people took you seriously. This was indifference. The intellectual world had looked at Hume's masterwork and shrugged. He was devastated. This wasn't supposed to happen. He'd sacrificed years, lived in poverty, poured everything into this project. He'd imagined recognition, debate, fame. Instead, he got nothing. The 3rd volume appeared in 1740, covering morality and politics. It did slightly better, but only slightly. A few more people noticed. The arguments about ethics attracted some attention, but overall, the treatise remained what it had been from the start, an ambitious failure. Hume tried to salvage things. Maybe the problem was presentation. Maybe he'd been too abstract, too technical, too caught up in philosophical jargon. In 1740, he published an abstract of a treatise of human nature, attempting to explain his own book in simpler terms. This was humiliating. Philosophers aren't supposed to need to write simplified versions of their arguments, but Hume was desperate. The abstract didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. Now he was the guy who'd written an incomprehensible book, and then had to explain what he'd meant. By 1741, Hume had accepted reality. The treatise was dead. His philosophical career, before it had properly begun, appeared to be over. He was 30 years old, living with his mother and brother in Scotland, unemployed with no prospects. But David Hume was nothing if not stubborn. If the philosophical world wouldn't accept his arguments in one form, he'd try another. He abandoned the dense academic style of the treatise and began writing essays, short, clear, witty pieces on politics, economics, literature, and philosophy. Essays that educated people might actually read. The transformation was remarkable. The same mind that had produced the impenetrable treatise now generated prose of crystalline clarity. Hume discovered he had a gift for the essay form. He could take complex ideas and make them not just understandable, but entertaining. In 1741 and 1742, he published 2 volumes of essays, moral and political. These were different from anything he'd done before. They were accessible, they were clever, they had personality. One essay argued that polygamy was economically inefficient. Another examined whether the British government leaned more toward absolute monarchy or republicanism. A third explored the character differences between ancient and modern nations. The essays sold, not spectacularly, but respectably. People actually read them. Hume began to develop a reputation, not as a profound philosopher, but as an intelligent commentator on contemporary issues. It wasn't what he'd wanted, but it was something. Still, he needed money. Writing essays wouldn't pay the bills. He needed a position, something stable that would allow him to continue his intellectual work. In 1744, an opportunity appeared. The chair of ethics and pneumatical philosophy at the University of Edinburgh became vacant. Hume applied. On paper, he was qualified. He'd written extensively on ethics and the philosophy of mind. His treatise, whatever its commercial failure, demonstrated serious philosophical ability, but Hume had made enemies. The religious establishment in Scotland viewed him with deep suspicion. His arguments about miracles, about the origins of religion, about the limits of reason, all suggested dangerous skepticism. Worse, there were rumours about his personal beliefs. Did Hume believe in God? Was he an atheist? Hume denied being an atheist. He was careful always to deny it. But his denials were unconvincing. His philosophy left no room for divine intervention, no space for revealed religion, no foundation for traditional faith. Anyone reading carefully could see that. The position went to someone else. Hume was rejected explicitly because of his religious views, or lack thereof. The university couldn't appoint someone suspected of atheism. It would cause a scandal. This pattern would repeat throughout Hume's life. Positions would open, he'd apply, his qualifications would be obvious, and then religious opposition would emerge and he'd be passed over. The intellectual establishment that should have embraced him kept him at arm's length, so Hume took what he could get. In 1745, he became tutor to the Marquess of Annandale, a young nobleman who was, to put it delicately, mentally unstable. The job was miserable. The Marquess was difficult, sometimes violent. The household was chaotic. Hume lasted a year before the situation became intolerable and he resigned. Next came a position as secretary to General James St. Clair, who was leading a military expedition. Hume, the philosopher who'd spent years in quiet French libraries, found himself accompanying an army. The expedition was a disaster, poorly planned and badly executed. But it paid well, and it gave Hume something he desperately needed: money. With his earnings from the military work, Hume returned to his mother's house in Scotland and did something unexpected. He rewrote the treatise, not revised it, but completely rewrote it from scratch. Same arguments, different presentation. Simpler language, clearer structure, more accessible examples. In 1748, he published an enquiry concerning human understanding. In 1751, an enquiry concerning the principles of morals followed. These were the treatise arguments repackaged for a wider audience. Hume had learned his lesson. Philosophy needed to be readable. The inquiries succeeded where the treatise had failed. Not immediately, but gradually. People read them. People discussed them. People understood what Hume was arguing, even if they disagreed. The ideas began to spread. The most famous section was about miracles. Hume argued that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the falsehood of that testimony would be more miraculous than the event it describes. In other words, which is more likely, that the laws of nature have been violated, or that someone is mistaken or lying? Given everything we know about how the world works, the latter is always more probable. This was dynamite. It attacked the evidential basis of Christianity without directly attacking Christianity itself. Hume never said miracles were impossible, just that we could never have sufficient evidence to believe in them. It was devastating precisely because it was so reasonable. Religious authorities were furious. Pamphlets appeared refuting Hume. Sermons denounced him. But now, finally, people were paying attention. Even negative attention was better than indifference. By his early 40s, Hume had achieved a strange kind of success. He wasn't a professor. He hadn't been embraced by the universities, but he was widely read. His essays were popular. His philosophical works, while controversial, were taken seriously. He'd become a public intellectual, someone whose opinions mattered. In 1752, another academic position opened, this time at the University of Glasgow. Again, Hume applied. Again, religious opposition blocked him. The Scottish Church viewed him as a threat to faith and morals. No university, under their influence, would hire him. Hume's response was characteristically practical. If he couldn't be a professor, he'd be something else. In 1752, he accepted a position as librarian to the Faculty of Advocates in Edinburgh. It wasn't prestigious and the pay was modest, but it gave him something invaluable: access to one of the best libraries in Scotland. With thousands of books at his disposal, Hume embarked on his most ambitious project yet. He would write a comprehensive history of England. Not philosophy this time, but history. A massive, multi-volume chronicle covering centuries of English political development. Why history? Partly because Hume believed history was where philosophy met reality. Abstract arguments about human nature needed to be tested against actual human behaviour across time. History was the laboratory of the moral sciences, but also, frankly, because history sold. Philosophical treatises might reach a few hundred readers. A well-written history could reach thousands. Hume needed money, and history was where the money was. He started with the Stuart period, the 17th century, the most controversial era in English history. The Civil War, the execution of Charles I, Cromwell's Commonwealth, the Restoration. These events were still politically charged. Everyone had opinions. Hume knew his interpretation would provoke debate. And it did. When the first volume appeared in 1754, both Whigs and Tories hated it. Hume had tried to be balanced, to see both sides, to avoid partisan judgments. This satisfied no one. The Whigs thought he was too sympathetic to the Stuarts. The Tories thought he was too critical. Everyone was angry, but they were reading. The book sold. Controversy, Hume discovered, was good for sales. He continued writing, working backward through English history. Volume after volume appeared. The Tudor period, the medieval kings, the Anglo-Saxon era. Each instalment expanded the narrative, deepening the analysis. The history of England would eventually run to 6 volumes and would become, for a century, the standard history of England. It made Hume famous in a way his philosophy never had. People who'd never heard of the treatise knew the history. It was read in Britain, translated across Europe, assigned in schools. Finally, after decades of struggle, David Hume was successful. Not as he'd originally planned, not through abstract philosophy, but through writing that connected ideas to life. He was in his 50s, financially secure for the first time, widely respected, if not universally loved. But the intellectual world was about to change in ways Hume couldn't predict. Across Europe, a generation of younger thinkers was reading his work and taking it seriously, more seriously than he'd imagined possible. One of them, a Prussian professor who'd spent his entire life in a single city, would claim that Hume had awakened him from dogmatic slumber. That professor's name was Immanuel Kant, and the awakening would reshape philosophy forever. But before we get to that, we need to understand what Hume actually argued, what made his ideas so dangerous, and why a man who died thinking himself a failure would eventually be recognised as one of the most important philosophers who ever lived. The core of Hume's philosophy rests on a simple observation that becomes devastating when you follow it to its logical conclusion. Everything we know comes through our senses. Every idea in our mind, no matter how abstract or complex, ultimately traces back to some impression we've received from the world. You've never seen a unicorn, but you've seen horses, and you've seen horns, and your imagination combines them. The concept of justice seems lofty and universal, but it's built from memories of fairness and unfairness you've actually experienced. Strip away the sensory foundation, Hume argued, and you're left with nothing. Just empty words. This sounds reasonable enough. Most people nod along when they hear it. Then Hume pushes further. If all knowledge comes from experience, what about causation? We believe the sun will rise tomorrow because it's risen every day before. We believe fire causes heat because we've always seen the two together. But here's the problem. We never actually see causation itself. Watch carefully the next time you see one billiard ball strike another. You see the first ball moving, you see contact, you see the second ball moving, but the causing, the necessary connection between the two events, that's invisible. It's not in the experience, it's something your mind adds. You assume the connection is there because you've seen similar sequences countless times. But assumption isn't knowledge. The future might not resemble the past. There's no logical contradiction in imagining that tomorrow, for the first time in history, bread will poison you instead of nourishing you. You believe otherwise based purely on habit. Experience has trained you to expect certain patterns, but expectation isn't proof. This is the problem of induction, and it's more unsettling than it first appears. Science depends entirely on the assumption that nature behaves consistently, that experiments can be replicated, that what happened yesterday tells us something reliable about what will happen tomorrow. But if Hume's right, that assumption can't be rationally justified. It's just a habit of thought, however useful. Newton's laws don't describe necessary truths about how reality must work. They describe patterns we've observed and expect to continue. But why should they continue? Because they always have. That's circular reasoning. You're using the reliability of past patterns to prove that past patterns are reliable. Most of Hume's readers found this absurd. Obviously, causation is real. Obviously, the future will resemble the past in its basic structure. Hume agreed with them in practice. He wasn't suggesting we abandon science or start doubting whether bread will nourish us. His point was more subtle. We live by beliefs we cannot rationally prove. Custom and habit, not reason, guide most of human life. And that's fine. That's how we're built. But we shouldn't confuse practical necessity with logical proof. Then there's the self. Who are you? The question seems to have an obvious answer. You're you, the same person who woke up this morning, who remembers yesterday, who plans for tomorrow. There's a continuous identity threading through your entire life. Except when Hume looked inward to find this self, he couldn't locate it. He found perceptions, memories, sensations, emotions, thoughts, all flowing through consciousness in an endless stream. But he couldn't find the thing supposedly having these perceptions. The self that's supposed to be separate from the experiences, that's supposed to own them and connect them. Where is it? Strip away all the particular experiences, what's left? Nothing Hume could identify. Maybe the self is just the bundle of perceptions. Not something separate that has experiences, but just the experiences themselves, held together by memory and causation. We feel like unified beings because memory creates continuity, but that feeling might be an illusion, a useful fiction the mind constructs, but not a metaphysical reality. This challenged everything. Christianity taught that the soul was an immaterial, eternal substance. Philosophers from Plato through Descartes had built elaborate arguments for the existence of a thinking substance distinct from the body. Hume was suggesting it might not exist at all, that what we call the self is just a convenient way of talking about a collection of fleeting mental states. He wasn't claiming to have proven this. He admitted the question puzzled him, but the traditional answers didn't hold up under scrutiny, and if they didn't hold up, maybe they were wrong. His treatment of religion followed similar patterns. Not frontal assault, but careful questioning that undermined the foundations. The argument from design was popular in Hume's era. Look at the complexity of nature, people said. The intricate structure of the eye, the perfect orbits of planets, the harmony of ecosystems. Such order requires a designer. Just as a watch implies a watchmaker, the universe implies God. Hume dissected this in his dialogues concerning natural religion, published posthumously because he knew it was too dangerous to release while alive. The argument from design, he pointed out, depends on analogy. The universe is like a machine. Machines have makers, therefore the universe has a maker. But how strong is that analogy, really? We've seen humans make machines. We've never seen anyone make a universe. We know machines are artifacts because we can compare them to natural objects. But we have no other universes to compare ours to. Maybe universes just happen. Maybe they grow organically like plants rather than being constructed like machines. Maybe multiple gods created it by committee, making mistakes as they went. The design argument assumes one perfect deity, but the evidence, if you're honest, suggests something messier. And if you're arguing from evidence, you have to account for all the evidence. What about earthquakes, diseases, predators? What about the vast stretches of empty space, the countless planets hostile to life? If this universe reveals anything about its creator, it reveals a being with mixed motives and limited power. Not the omnipotent, perfectly good God of Christianity. Hume wasn't saying God definitely doesn't exist. He was saying the philosophical arguments don't work. You can't get from observations about nature to confident conclusions about supernatural creators. Faith might have its reasons, but they're not the reasons philosophers typically offer. His essay on miracles made the point even more sharply. A miracle, by definition, violates natural law. It's something that shouldn't happen according to our understanding of how the world works. But our understanding of natural laws comes from uniform experience. We believe the dead stay dead because we've never seen an exception. So when someone claims they witnessed a resurrection, you're being asked to believe something contradicts all previous experience. Which is more likely? That natural laws were actually suspended in this one case, or that the testimony is mistaken. Maybe the witness is lying. Maybe they're confused. Maybe they saw something explainable that they interpreted as miraculous. Even if the witness is honest and intelligent, human testimony is fallible. We know people make mistakes, misremember, exaggerate. That happens all the time. Miracles, by definition, don't. So the rational response to any miracle claim is skepticism. Not because miracles are impossible, but because the evidence required to establish something that contradicts all previous experience would need to be extraordinary. And human testimony, no matter how sincere, isn't extraordinary evidence. It's exactly the kind of evidence we know is frequently unreliable. This didn't make Hume popular with the clergy, or with most of his contemporaries, but younger readers found it liberating. Here was someone willing to follow arguments wherever they led, even when the conclusions were uncomfortable. Someone who took reason seriously enough to acknowledge its limits. The moral philosophy went in yet another unexpected direction. Most thinkers grounded ethics in reason. The rationalists said moral truths were logical necessities, like mathematical proofs. You could deduce what's right and wrong through pure thought. Hume disagreed completely. Morality, he argued, isn't about reason at all. Reason tells you what is, not what ought to be. You can't derive an ought from an is. You can observe that an action causes suffering, but you need something beyond observation to conclude that causing suffering is wrong, that something is feeling, not thought. We call actions virtuous or vicious based on whether they produce approval or disapproval in us. And that approval or disapproval is an emotional response, not a logical conclusion. You see someone help a stranger, and you feel admiration. That feeling, not some rational calculation, is what makes you judge the action as good. This doesn't make morality arbitrary. Human beings share similar emotional responses because we share similar natures. Most people across cultures feel sympathy when others suffer. Most people approve of kindness and disapprove of cruelty. These common sentiments create the foundation for moral agreement. Ethics is rooted in human nature, not in abstract principles existing independently of us. The position became known as moral sentimentalism, and it influenced thinkers for generations. Adam Smith, Hume's close friend, built his own moral philosophy around similar ideas. The emotional basis of ethics would be debated and refined by philosophers well into the next century. But it was the epistemology, the theory of knowledge, that proved most influential and most troubling. Because once you accept Hume's premises, once you agree that all knowledge comes from experience, and that experience shows us only sequences of events, not necessary connections, the foundations of everything start to crumble. Mathematics seems safe. 2 + 2 = 4 necessarily, not because we've observed it repeatedly, but because it's logically certain. Except Hume had an answer for that too. Mathematical truths, he said, are relations of ideas, not matters of fact. They're true by definition. A triangle has 3 sides because that's what we mean by triangle. Change the definitions and you change the truths. Mathematical certainty comes at a price. It tells us nothing about the world. It's just our concepts, arranged consistently. Real knowledge, knowledge about what actually exists beyond our ideas, comes from experience alone. And experience, as we've seen, can never yield certainty, only probability at best. The best we can do is observe patterns, form expectations, and act on them. But we should never confuse strong habits of belief with genuine knowledge of necessary truths. This is what Kant meant when he said Hume awakened him from a dogmatic slumber. For years, Kant had accepted the rationalist tradition. Reason could discover necessary truths about reality. The world had an underlying structure that pure thought could grasp. Then he read Hume and realized the entire edifice rested on assumptions that couldn't be defended. Kant spent the next decade trying to answer Hume, trying to show how knowledge was possible despite the skeptical challenge. The result was the Critique of Pure Reason, one of the most important and difficult books in the history of philosophy. But Kant never refuted Hume, not completely. He shifted the terms of debate, argued that the mind actively structures experience rather than passively receiving it. But the fundamental problem Hume identified, the gap between what we experience and what we claim to know, that problem remained. Generations of philosophers have wrestled with it since. Some try to dissolve it, arguing Hume asked the wrong questions. Others embrace it, accepting that certainty is impossible and we must live with uncertainty. Others try to rebuild knowledge on new foundations, foundations that might withstand human skepticism. None have succeeded in a way that satisfies everyone. The problem of induction, the question of causation, the nature of the self, these remain live issues in contemporary philosophy, which means Hume's questions, asked nearly 3 centuries ago in Edinburgh, are still our questions. That's what makes him more than historically interesting. He's not a figure we study to understand the 18th century, though he does illuminate it. He's a thinker whose arguments remain actively challenging, whose positions are still defended, attacked, refined, and reformulated. But in his own time, even after the history brought fame, Hume was increasingly aware that his philosophical legacy was uncertain. The works he cared about most, the works that carried his deepest convictions, were either misunderstood or ignored. He'd spent his life arguing against superstition and dogmatism, and at the end, he would face one final test of his own principles. In 1763, Hume was offered a position that seemed designed to prove every satirist's wildest fantasy. He would become private secretary to the British ambassador to France. David Hume, the atheist philosopher, the man who'd spent decades attacking religion and aristocratic pretension, would now navigate the elaborate rituals of the French court. The appointment came through the Earl of Hertford, who needed someone capable of handling diplomatic correspondence and managing complex negotiations. Hume's reputation as a historian had reached Paris. His philosophical notoriety, paradoxically, made him fashionable rather than dangerous in French circles. The philosophes, the radical thinkers of the Enlightenment, saw him as an ally. The aristocrats found him amusing. Hume accepted. At 52, he'd finally achieved financial security from his history, but the prospect of Paris was irresistible. This was the centre of European intellectual life, home to Voltaire, Diderot, d'Alembert, and countless others whose ideas were reshaping the world. He arrived in October 1763 and was immediately surrounded. The salons of Paris competed for his presence. Wealthy hostesses sent elaborate invitations. Intellectuals sought his conversation. Women of the highest society flattered him outrageously, calling him their dear Saint David, their gentle giant. It should have been absurd. Hume was overweight, unfashionable, spoke terrible French with an impenetrable Scottish accent, and represented everything the refined French should have disdained. Instead, they adored him. The philosopher who'd argued that human nature was driven by sentiment and sympathy found his theory confirmed in the most unexpected way. He was loved, not despite his appearance and manner, but because of something else: his warmth, his good humour, his genuine kindness. The French aristocracy had plenty of witty cynics. Hume offered something different: philosophical depth combined with emotional authenticity. He made people feel better about themselves simply by being in his presence. The letters he sent back to Scotland overflow with bemused delight. He attended the opera, dined with duchesses, discussed metaphysics with the finest minds in Europe. He was, he admitted, having the time of his life. But Paris brought more than social triumph. It brought Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The meeting between Hume and Rousseau should have been a triumph of Enlightenment fellowship. Both were outsiders who challenged orthodoxy. Both had suffered for their ideas. Both believed in human dignity against the pretensions of traditional authority. Rousseau had written The Social Contract, which argued that legitimate government rests on the consent of the governed. He'd written Emile, which reimagined education around the natural development of the child. He'd written The Discourse on Inequality, which traced human corruption to the invention of private property. He was brilliant, visionary, and completely impossible. By 1763, Rousseau was also in serious trouble. His books had been banned in both France and Geneva. He'd been driven from place to place, always one step ahead of authorities who wanted him silenced or arrested. He was paranoid, convinced that elaborate conspiracies surrounded him, that former friends had become secret enemies plotting his destruction. Some of this was justified. He really was being persecuted. Some of it was madness. When Hume met Rousseau in Paris, he saw a man of genius in desperate need of help. Rousseau needed asylum somewhere safe, somewhere beyond the reach of French and Genevan authorities. Hume offered to bring him to England. The journey began in January 1766. Hume and Rousseau travelled together across France, then across the Channel. Crowds gathered at Dover to see the famous philosopher. Rousseau wore Armenian dress, a deliberate eccentricity that attracted attention. He was both fleeing persecution and courting fame. Hume arranged comfortable lodgings for Rousseau in the countryside, negotiated a pension from King George III, and worked tirelessly to ensure his guests' safety and comfort. For a few months, everything seemed fine. Then Rousseau's paranoia turned on Hume himself. The accusations began slowly, then accelerated. Rousseau became convinced that Hume was part of a vast conspiracy against him. The pension from the king was a plot to humiliate him. The comfortable lodgings were a trap. Hume's kindness was manipulation. Every friendly gesture concealed malicious intent. The evidence Rousseau offered was bizarre. The way Hume looked at him at dinner, the timing of certain letters, the fact that Hume had too many powerful friends. It made no sense. Hume was devastated. He'd sacrificed time, money, and reputation to help Rousseau. He'd defended him against critics. He'd opened doors that had been firmly closed, and now he was being accused of orchestrating a campaign of persecution by the very person he'd tried to save. The quarrel became public. Rousseau wrote long, rambling letters detailing Hume's alleged crimes. Hume, against his better judgment, published a defence. The philosophes took sides. European society watched with fascination as two of its most famous thinkers destroyed their friendship in spectacular fashion. Hume returned to Scotland in 1767, exhausted and disillusioned. The Paris triumph had ended in personal catastrophe. Rousseau, meanwhile, continued his wandering, never escaping the enemies that existed primarily in his own mind. What had happened? Hume's philosophy offered one explanation. Human nature is driven by passions, by sentiments that reason can only serve. Rousseau's passion was pride, an overwhelming need for independence that made any obligation feel like chains. Hume's generosity, no matter how genuine, placed Rousseau in debt, and Rousseau, unable to bear that debt, transformed it in his mind into persecution. The conspiracy wasn't real, but the emotional logic behind it was perfectly human. Another explanation is simpler. Rousseau was mentally ill, suffering from what modern diagnosis might call paranoid delusions. The genius that produced Emile and the social contract coexisted with a mind increasingly unable to distinguish reality from imagination. Either way, the episode revealed something important about Hume. For all his philosophical skepticism, for all his attacks on traditional morality, he believed deeply in friendship, in gratitude, in the bonds of human affection. When those bonds were betrayed, when his generosity was repaid with accusations, he was genuinely hurt in a way that no abstract philosophical argument could produce. The man who'd written that reason is the slave of the passions knew it from experience. His own passions, his own need for affection and respect, had led him into a disaster that reason alone could never have prevented. Hume settled back in Edinburgh in 1769. He was 60, wealthy enough from his histories to live comfortably, famous enough to be welcomed everywhere. He bought a house on the newly built street, Andrew Square, in the elegant new town that was rising to replace Edinburgh's medieval squalor. He furnished it carefully, hosted dinners for friends, and settled into what he hoped would be a peaceful final chapter. He was done with philosophy. The major works had been written decades earlier, misunderstood or ignored. The histories had brought success, but belonged to a different genre entirely. What remained was simply to live well, to enjoy the friendships and comforts he'd earned, to face whatever came with the equanimity his philosophy recommended. What came was illness. In 1775, Hume began experiencing digestive problems. He lost weight rapidly, going from corpulent to gaunt in a matter of months. The doctors diagnosed what they called an abdominal disorder. Modern medical historians suspect colon cancer. There was no treatment. Hume understood he was dying. His response became his final philosophical statement, one that would provoke more outrage than anything he'd written. He faced death exactly as his philosophy predicted he would, calmly, without fear, and without the slightest gesture toward religious consolation. Friends visited throughout the final year. They found him cheerful, witty, still eager to discuss ideas. He continued to revise his essays, preparing a final edition. He wrote letters maintaining his correspondence until physical weakness made it impossible. He joked about his condition, told stories, refused to pretend he expected recovery. The philosopher who'd spent his life arguing against superstition and supernatural belief was now demonstrating in the most dramatic way possible that those beliefs were unnecessary. You could die well without them. James Boswell, the famous biographer, visited Hume in July 1776. Boswell was a Christian, troubled by doubt, desperate to find in Hume's final days some crack in the skeptical armour, some deathbed conversion that would prove religion's truth. He questioned Hume directly about immortality. Did Hume not hope for an afterlife? No, Hume replied pleasantly. The idea made no sense. It was a contradiction to reason and experience. But surely, Boswell pressed, surely as death approached, some religious feeling must arise? None, Hume assured him. He was perfectly comfortable with the prospect of annihilation. When you die, you simply cease to exist, exactly as you didn't exist before you were born. There's nothing frightening about it once you abandon superstitious terrors. Boswell left shaken. He later wrote that Hume's calm atheism in the face of death was the most horrible thing he'd ever witnessed. Other visitors had similar reactions. They couldn't reconcile Hume's kindness, his warmth, his obvious goodness as a human being, with his complete rejection of religion. Surely, they thought, goodness requires a religious foundation. Surely, morality cannot survive without God. Yet here was David Hume, dying peacefully, having lived a life of integrity and friendship, all without believing a word of Christian doctrine. Adam Smith, Hume's closest friend and the author of The Wealth of Nations, visited constantly during the final weeks. The two men had known each other for decades. They'd shaped each other's thinking. Smith had dedicated his first book to Hume. Now he watched his friend die with a mixture of grief and admiration. Hume, Smith would later write, approached death as nearly to the idea of a perfectly wise and virtuous man as perhaps the nature of human frailty will permit. This was extraordinary testimony. Smith wasn't claiming Hume was perfect. He was saying that Hume had achieved as much wisdom and virtue as any human being could reasonably hope to achieve. And he'd done it without religious belief. On August 25th, 1776, David Hume died at his home in Edinburgh. He was 65 years old. His last weeks had been spent in conversation with friends, settling his affairs and maintaining the same good humour that had characterised his entire life. There was no drama, no crisis of faith, no last-minute reversal. He died as he'd lived, skeptical, humane, and utterly convinced that this life was all we have and therefore worth living well. The funeral was attended by thousands. Edinburgh turned out to watch the procession, some mourning a great man, others simply curious to see how an atheist's burial would proceed. It proceeded normally. Hume was buried in Calton Hill Cemetery, in a simple tomb that still stands today. His estate went to his family and friends. His unpublished manuscripts went to Adam Smith, who was tasked with preparing final editions. But the real controversy came from what Smith published shortly after Hume's death, a letter describing Hume's final days, emphasising his cheerfulness and his lack of religious feeling. The letter was titled My Own Life, Hume's Brief Autobiography, and Smith's account of his death. Together, they painted a picture of a good man dying well without God. The reaction was volcanic. Ministers across Britain denounced Hume from the pulpit. Pamphlets appeared attacking both Hume and Smith. How dare they suggest that virtue was possible without religion? How dare they present atheism as compatible with a peaceful death? The intensity of the reaction revealed something important. Hume had struck at the deepest fear, that morality might not need divine enforcement, that human beings might be capable of goodness, friendship, and virtue based on nothing more than natural sentiment and social bonds. If Hume was right, then the entire apparatus of religious authority, the promises of heaven and threats of hell, the priesthood's claim to moral guidance, all of it was unnecessary. People could be good simply because they were people, because sympathy and fellow feeling were part of human nature. This was more threatening than any technical philosophical argument. This was existential, and Hume had proved it not through logic, but through his life and death. The skeptical philosopher who'd attacked every traditional belief had lived better than most believers. He'd been kinder, more generous, more faithful in friendship, more cheerful in adversity, and he died without fear, without regret, without reaching for the consolations that religion promised. The scandal of David Hume's death refused to die with him. In drawing rooms across Britain, at university common rooms, in the pages of journals and newspapers, the debate raged on. Not about his philosophy, but about his character. Could an unbeliever truly be virtuous? Could someone who rejected divine justice live a moral life? The Edinburgh clergy were particularly incensed. Here was one of their own, a son of Scotland, who'd lived among them for years, whose cheerfulness and kindness were undeniable, who just died without a hint of repentance. It was intolerable. They preached sermons condemning him. They wrote pamphlets. They warned their congregations that Hume's apparent virtue was a deception, that his calm death was false courage masking inner terror. But the facts wouldn't cooperate with this narrative. Too many people had known Hume personally. Too many had witnessed his generosity, his loyalty, his genuine concern for others. The attack on his character failed because his character was too well established. What his critics couldn't admit was that Hume had performed an experiment, not in a laboratory, but with his life. The question was whether morality required supernatural sanctions, whether human beings needed the fear of hell and the promise of heaven to behave decently toward one another. Hume's answer, embodied in decades of friendship and kindness, was no. Natural sympathy was enough. The bonds of family and community were enough. The simple human desire for approval and the aversion to causing pain, these were sufficient foundations for morality. This wasn't just philosophy, this was a working alternative to centuries of moral teaching, and it terrified people who'd built their entire worldview on divine command. But Hume's legacy extended far beyond the controversy surrounding his death. The questions he'd raised, the arguments he'd constructed, continued to echo through European thought. Philosophy, after Hume, could never return to the confident rationalism that preceded him. Consider what he'd accomplished. He'd shown that causation, the cornerstone of scientific reasoning, couldn't be rationally justified. We believe the future will resemble the past only through habit, not logic. He demonstrated that reason alone could never motivate action, that all our choices are ultimately driven by feeling. He'd argued that the self, the thing we think of as me, is just a bundle of perceptions with no underlying substance. And he'd suggested that miracles, by definition violations of natural law, could never have sufficient evidence to be believed. Each of these arguments was a bomb thrown at traditional philosophy and theology. Some exploded immediately, others were time-delayed, their full force only becoming apparent decades later. Immanuel Kant, working in distant Königsberg, read Hume and described the experience as being awakened from dogmatic slumber. The entire critical philosophy that Kant developed, the system that would dominate European thought for generations, was essentially an attempt to answer Hume, to save science and morality from Hume's skeptical acids. Jeremy Bentham read Hume and absorbed the idea that morality is grounded in feeling rather than reason. This became the foundation of utilitarianism, the philosophy that dominated British ethics for the next century. Charles Darwin read Hume's Natural History of Religion and found support for thinking about religious belief as a natural phenomenon, something that evolved rather than being divinely revealed. The connection between Hume's naturalism and Darwin's theory of evolution is direct. Even those who rejected Hume's conclusions had to contend with his arguments. You couldn't just ignore him. You had to either refute him or find a way to work around him. And most attempts at refutation failed. The problem was that Hume argued with devastating clarity. His prose was simple, his examples concrete, his logic tight. He didn't hide behind jargon or technical terminology. He made his case in plain English, and that made it harder to evade. But perhaps Hume's greatest contribution wasn't any particular argument, It was his method, his insistence on examining beliefs without prejudice, following arguments wherever they led, refusing to accept anything simply because it was traditional or comforting. This was the Enlightenment ideal made real. Not dogmatic atheism, not certainty in science, but genuine inquiry, willingness to question everything, including one's own conclusions. Hume showed that you could be skeptical about big questions, honest about uncertainty, and still live a full life, still have friends, still enjoy pleasures, still contribute to society. Skepticism didn't have to be paralyzing, it could be liberating. The man who claimed we couldn't rationally justify our most basic beliefs had nevertheless lived rationally. The philosopher who said reason was the slave of passion had nevertheless been reasonable. The thinker who questioned everything had nevertheless been certain about what mattered: friendship, kindness, truth-telling, the pursuit of understanding. There's something profoundly inspiring about this. Hume faced the void, the fundamental uncertainty of existence, and his response was to laugh, write brilliant essays, throw dinner parties, and be kind to his friends. No despair, no nihilism, no retreat into comfortable illusions. Just acceptance of uncertainty combined with commitment to living well anyway. This attitude, more than any specific argument, is Hume's real gift to subsequent generations. But we should also acknowledge where Hume got things wrong. His economic theories, while influential in his time, are now mostly forgotten. His political essays, while intelligent, contain defences of British imperialism that make uncomfortable reading. His views on race, typical of his era, were indefensible. Hume was a product of 18th century Scotland. He shared many of the prejudices of his time and place. Being skeptical about religion didn't automatically make him skeptical about empire or racial hierarchy. Those prejudices went unexamined. This is worth remembering. Intellectual brilliance doesn't guarantee moral enlightenment. A philosopher can be revolutionary in one domain while being entirely conventional in another. Hume revolutionized epistemology and ethics, but he didn't question the British Empire's right to rule India. He didn't examine the racial assumptions embedded in European thought. These blind spots don't negate his achievements, but they remind us that even the greatest thinkers are limited by their context. The challenge for us is to learn from Hume's method, his skeptical questioning, while applying it more consistently than he did, to direct that same scrutiny toward our own unexamined assumptions. What would Hume think if he could see philosophy today? The discipline he helped create has splintered into specialized subdisciplines, each with its own technical vocabulary and internal debates. Epistemology, ethics, metaphysics, philosophy of mind, philosophy of language, all pursue their questions with increasing sophistication and decreasing accessibility. He'd probably be dismayed by the obscurity. Hume believed philosophy should be comprehensible to educated general readers. He wrote for the drawing room, not just the seminar room. The professionalization of philosophy, its retreat into academia, would have struck him as a mistake, but he'd recognized the questions. The problem of induction that he identified is still debated. The relationship between reason and emotion in ethics is still contested. The nature of causation still puzzles philosophers of science. The problems he raised haven't been solved, they've just been refined. And in some areas, philosophy has moved in directions Hume anticipated. Experimental philosophy, which uses empirical methods to investigate philosophical questions, is essentially Hume's approach updated with modern tools. Naturalistic ethics, which grounds morality in human nature rather than divine command, follows Hume's path. Cognitive science, which studies the mind as a natural phenomenon, embodies Hume's empiricism. The skeptical tradition Hume represents never goes away entirely. It resurfaces whenever philosophers become too confident, too systematic, too sure they've found final answers. Hume reminds us that certainty is elusive, that our beliefs rest on shaky foundations, that we're not as rational as we think. This message remains relevant, perhaps especially now, in an age of political polarization and epistemic tribalism, when everyone's certain they're right and the other side is not just wrong, but evil. When confirmation bias is supercharged by social media algorithms, when people retreat into information bubbles that reinforce their existing beliefs. Hume's skepticism offers a corrective. Not cynicism, not the abandonment of truth-seeking, but humility about how much we actually know. Recognition that our beliefs are shaped by habit, emotion, and social influence more than pure reason. This doesn't mean all beliefs are equally valid. Hume wasn't a relativist. He thought we could distinguish better from worse theories, more reliable from less reliable sources, but he insisted that this distinction couldn't be made through pure reason alone. We need experience, experiment, careful observation of what actually works. In other words, we need science. Not science as a collection of facts, but science as a method. The willingness to test beliefs against reality, to revise theories when evidence demands it, to admit uncertainty where uncertainty exists. Hume was one of the first thinkers to fully grasp what this scientific attitude meant for philosophy. Not that philosophy should imitate physics, but that philosophy should adopt the same empirical spirit. Ground claims in observation, test theories against experience, admit the limits of what we can know. This vision of philosophy as continuous with science rather than separate from it has become increasingly influential. Many contemporary philosophers see themselves as working on problems adjacent to psychology, neuroscience, linguistics, or economics. They use findings from these sciences to inform philosophical arguments. Hume would approve. He always believed philosophy should engage with the world rather than spinning theories in isolation. But there's a tension here. The more philosophy becomes scientific, the more it risks losing its distinctive character. If philosophical questions can be answered by empirical research, are they still philosophical, or have they become scientific questions? Hume faced this tension himself. His treatise is simultaneously a work of philosophy and an attempt at scientific psychology. He's trying to discover the laws of human nature through introspection and observation. Is this philosophy or proto-psychology? The answer is probably both. The boundaries between disciplines are human constructs, useful for organizing universities, but not reflecting any deep truth about the structure of knowledge. Hume understood this. He moved freely between what we'd now call philosophy, psychology, history, economics, and literary criticism. He didn't recognize our departmental divisions. Maybe that's another lesson from Hume. The best thinking often happens at the boundaries between disciplines, where insights from one field illuminate problems in another. Specialization has its place, but so does the kind of broad integrative thinking that Hume exemplified. His influence extends beyond academic philosophy. Writers have admired his prose style. Historians have learned from his methods. Economists still cite his essays. Politicians have quoted his views on liberty and government. This breadth of impact reflects the breadth of Hume's own interests. He wrote about everything because he was curious about everything, and because he believed that understanding human nature required examining human beings in all their complexity. You couldn't understand morality without understanding emotion. You couldn't understand emotion without understanding the mind. You couldn't understand the mind without understanding society. Everything connected. This holistic approach is rare now. The pressure towards specialization is immense, but Hume reminds us what's possible when someone refuses to be confined by disciplinary boundaries. The man who couldn't get a university position became more influential than most professors ever dream of being. There's poetic justice in that. The institutions that rejected him now teach his works. The universities that wouldn't hire him now have departments dedicated to studying his ideas. The establishment that viewed him as dangerous now treats him as a canonical figure. Hume outlasted his critics, not through political maneuvering or institutional power, but through the sheer quality of his thinking. He wrote books that people still want to read 3 centuries later. He raised questions that still matter. He developed arguments that still work. That's the ultimate vindication. And perhaps it's also the ultimate answer to those who worried about his lack of religious belief. If immortality means anything, it means this: being remembered, being read, continuing to shape how people think long after you're gone. By that measure, David Hume achieved immortality. Not the supernatural kind he didn't believe in, but the only kind that actually exists. The immortality of influence, of ideas that refuse to die, of a voice that still speaks across the centuries. That voice carries a particular message, one that's uncomfortable for many, but impossible to ignore once you've heard it. We believe things without evidence. We trust our senses when they've proven unreliable. We construct grand theories about reality when we're trapped inside our own perceptions. Hume looked at humanity and saw self-deception elevated to an art form. But here's what makes him different from other skeptics. He wasn't trying to destroy our confidence in knowledge to be cruel or nihilistic. He was trying to be honest. And more than that, he was trying to show us that we could live perfectly well without the certainty we thought we needed. Most philosophers before Hume had assumed that knowledge required foundations. You needed absolutely certain starting points, self-evident truths that couldn't be doubted, and then you built everything else on top of them. Descartes with his "I think, therefore I am", Leibniz with his principle of sufficient reason. Even the empiricists like Locke assumed that our ideas, properly traced back to sense impressions, gave us reliable knowledge. Hume demolished all of it. There are no certain foundations. Our most basic beliefs about causation, the external world, personal identity, they all rest on nothing more solid than habit and feeling. We believe the sun will rise tomorrow not because we've proven it must, but because it always has, and our minds are built to expect patterns to continue. Does this mean we should stop believing these things? Absolutely not. Hume's point is that we couldn't stop believing them even if we tried. These beliefs are natural, automatic, inescapable. Philosophy might show they're unjustified, but philosophy can't make them go away. This is Hume's naturalism. We're animals with animal instincts and animal psychology. Reason is just one tool among many, and not even the most powerful one. When reason conflicts with instinct, instinct usually wins. Should win, really, because we need those instincts to survive. Try living as a pure skeptic for a day. Don't trust causation. Don't assume objects continue existing when you're not looking at them. Don't believe other people have minds. You'll last about 5 minutes before your natural beliefs reassert themselves, because you're a human being, not a philosophical thought experiment. This naturalistic turn in Hume's philosophy is perhaps his most important contribution. He showed that you can't do philosophy by pure reason alone. You have to take account of human psychology, human nature, the actual way our minds work rather than how we wish they'd work. Modern cognitive science has vindicated this approach spectacularly. We now know that human reasoning is shot through with biases, heuristics, and unconscious processes. The rational mind sitting on top, carefully weighing evidence, that's mostly fiction. We're driven by emotion, habit, and pattern recognition, operating below the level of conscious awareness. Hume understood this 300 years ago, without brain scans or psychological experiments. Just through careful introspection and observation, he figured out that reason is the slave of the passions, that our beliefs are formed by mechanisms we don't control and often don't understand, that we rationalize far more than we reason, and yet we function. We build bridges that don't fall down. We cure diseases. We send rockets to Mars. How is this possible if our minds are so unreliable? Hume's answer is that nature has equipped us well enough for practical purposes. Our instincts about causation work most of the time. Our assumptions about the external world are usually correct. Our moral sentiments generally guide us toward cooperation rather than conflict. We're not rational machines, but we're functional animals. This is a deeply humbling message. It means accepting that we're not the masters of our own minds, that we can't achieve the God's eye view of reality that philosophers had sought, that most of what we believe rests on foundations we can't justify. But it's also liberating. If you stop demanding certainty, you can focus on what actually works. If you accept that reason has limits, you can appreciate the value of other human capacities. Emotion, intuition, imagination, these aren't obstacles to knowledge. They're part of how knowledge happens. Hume showed us how to be comfortable with uncertainty. Not by pretending we have answers we don't have, but by recognizing that uncertainty is the human condition, and we're doing fine anyway. We don't need metaphysical foundations to live good lives, pursue truth, create beauty, treat each other decently. This might be his most radical claim. That philosophy can't give us what religion promised, absolute truth and cosmic purpose, but we don't need those things. We can build meaning from the bottom up, from our actual experiences and relationships and projects, without requiring validation from any transcendent realm. Some found this message depressing, a universe without inherent meaning, a life without ultimate purpose, knowledge without certainty. But Hume saw it differently. He saw freedom. You're not bound by ancient authorities or sacred texts. You're not required to believe things that make no sense. You're not condemned for honest doubt. You can think for yourself, follow evidence where it leads, change your mind when you learn something new. That's not depressing. That's enlightenment in its purest form. And it's dangerous. Hume knew this. Ideas that undermine authority always are. The people who benefit from the status quo, who derive power from unquestioned dogmas, they have every reason to silence thinkers like Hume, which is why he was so careful, so strategic, so willing to hide his most radical views in footnotes and appendices. But the ideas escaped anyway. They always do. You can't suppress a powerful argument by refusing to engage with it. You can only drive it underground, where it spreads through different channels, reaching people who are ready to hear it. Hume's skepticism spread through the Enlightenment like a virus, infecting one thinker after another. Some tried to develop antibodies, philosophical systems immune to human doubt. Kant built his entire critical philosophy as a response to Hume, trying to save science and morality from skeptical dissolution. Did he succeed? Philosophers still argue about that. Others embraced the infection. The French philosophes, Voltaire and Diderot and d'Holbach, they read Hume and recognized a kindred spirit, someone who'd seen through the pretensions of religion and metaphysics, who understood that human welfare mattered more than theological correctness, who believed in progress through reason rather than revelation. The Scottish Enlightenment that Hume helped create produced Adam Smith, whose economic theories still shape global capitalism. It produced James Hutton, whose geology revealed the Earth's vast age and prepared the ground for Darwin. It produced a whole generation of thinkers who believed human beings could understand nature and improve society through observation and experiment rather than ancient authority. This wasn't just academic philosophy. These ideas had political consequences. If authority rests on consent rather than divine right, then governments can be challenged, reformed, overthrown when they fail to serve the people. If morality comes from human nature rather than scripture, then we can revise our moral codes as we learn more about what actually promotes human flourishing. The American founders read Hume. Jefferson owned his complete works. Madison cited him in the Federalist Papers. When they designed a government based on checks and balances rather than trust in virtuous rulers, they were applying human insights about human nature. People are self-interested. Power corrupts. You need institutional structures that make self-interest serve the common good, rather than hoping for philosopher kings who'll govern wisely. The French revolutionaries read Hume too, though they took his ideas in directions he probably wouldn't have approved. Hume was a moderate, a reformer, not a revolutionary. He believed in gradual change, in preserving what works while fixing what doesn't. The terror would have appalled him, but ideas have their own logic. Once you've questioned one authority, It's hard to stop. Once you've shown that kings don't rule by divine right, people start asking why there should be kings at all. Once you've demonstrated that reason should guide belief, people start demanding rational justifications for every social institution. Hume opened doors he couldn't close. He asked questions that led to other questions. He created space for doubt that kept expanding. This is what happens when you do philosophy honestly. You can't control where it goes. The 19th century wrestled with Hume's legacy. The Romantics reacted against his cool rationalism, insisting that feeling and intuition revealed truths that reason couldn't reach. They had a point. Hume might have agreed with them. He'd always said sentiment matters more than reason in moral and aesthetic judgment. The utilitarians claimed Hume as their ancestor. Bentham and Mill built ethical systems on the principle that pleasure and pain, happiness and suffering were what ultimately mattered. This was human in spirit, base morality on human nature and human welfare, not on abstract principles or divine commands. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is deeply human. Not that Hume anticipated Darwin, but he'd prepared the intellectual ground. His naturalistic approach to human nature, his insistence that we understand ourselves as part of the natural world rather than separate from it, his willingness to explain mental phenomena through mechanical principles, all of this made Darwin's revolution possible. When Darwin showed that humans evolved from other species, that our moral sentiments developed through natural selection, that there's no unbridgeable gap between human and animal minds, he was extending human naturalism into biology. The uproar that followed proved how threatening these ideas remained. The 20th century brought logical positivism, a philosophical movement that tried to make Hume's empiricism even more rigorous. Their verification principle, that meaningful statements must be either empirically testable or true by definition, was human skepticism systematized. They wanted to eliminate metaphysics entirely, to restrict philosophy to logic and the analysis of scientific language. It didn't work. The verification principle turned out to be self-refuting, and philosophy proved impossible to confine within such narrow bounds. But the positivists' failure doesn't diminish Hume's achievement. He'd already shown the limits of pure empiricism. He knew that our most important beliefs, causation, the external world, other minds, couldn't meet strict empiricist standards. The difference is that Hume accepted this. The positivists tried to fix it. Hume was comfortable saying that some of our beliefs are unjustifiable, but indispensable. The positivists wanted everything justified or eliminated. Hume understood human nature better. Contemporary philosophy still orbits around problems Hume identified. The problem of induction remains unsolved. We still don't have a satisfactory account of how we acquire knowledge, of causal relationships. Philosophers still debate whether moral judgments express facts or feelings. The free will debate continues with no resolution in sight. Some see this as philosophy's failure. 300 years and we're still arguing about the same questions? But maybe that's the wrong way to look at it. Maybe some questions don't have final answers. Maybe the value is in the inquiry itself, in thinking more carefully about issues that matter, in understanding the difficulties, even if we can't resolve them. Hume would probably say, that's exactly right. Philosophy's job isn't to provide certainty, it's to help us think clearly about difficult questions, to expose bad arguments, to show us the limits of what we can know. That's not failure, that's success. And in a broader sense, Hume succeeded completely. He wanted to bring philosophy down to earth, to connect it with actual human life, rather than abstract speculation. He wanted to show that we could live well without the metaphysical and religious certainties that previous ages had claimed. He wanted to demonstrate that reason, properly understood, supports tolerance and moderation rather than dogmatism and fanaticism. Look around. The world Hume helped create is the world we live in. a world where science investigates nature without theological interference, where governments justify themselves by results rather than divine authority, where people question inherited beliefs and demand evidence, where tolerance is a virtue and fanaticism a vice, where human welfare matters more than ideological purity. This isn't a perfect world. Hume wouldn't have expected perfection, but it's a world shaped by Enlightenment values that he spent his life defending. The fact that those values are now under attack from various directions only proves how much they matter. Human nature hasn't changed since Hume's time. We're still capable of all the irrationality, prejudice, and self-deception he diagnosed. We still construct grand theories on flimsy evidence. We still let passion override reason. We still believe what we want to believe. But we're also still capable of honesty, of admitting when we don't know, of following arguments where they lead even when we don't like the destination. That capacity is what Hume trusted. Not that everyone would exercise it, but that enough people would, enough of the time, to make progress possible. He died trusting it. And maybe that's the real lesson. Not that Hume solved all the problems. He didn't. Not that he gave us certainty about anything. He explicitly denied that was possible. But he showed us how to think without certainty, how to live with doubt, how to be intellectually honest, even when honesty leads to uncomfortable conclusions. That's harder than it sounds. Most people, most of the time, want answers. They want to know they're right. They want foundations that won't crumble. Hume said those foundations don't exist, and he was fine with it. There's something almost heroic in that. A man who spent his entire career dismantling the intellectual structures his civilization had built, who showed that the things we think we know, we don't really know, who demonstrated that our most basic beliefs rest on habit rather than reason, and who concluded from all this, not that we should despair, but that we should be modest, tolerant, and focus on making life better rather than achieving impossible certainty. The study in Edinburgh where he died is gone now. The house was demolished long ago, but you can still visit his tomb in Calton Hill Cemetery. It's a simple Roman-style monument, circular, unadorned, no religious symbols, no quotes from his books, just his name and dates. Which is fitting. Hume didn't want to be remembered as a prophet or sage. He wanted to be remembered as someone who thought clearly and wrote well, someone who tried to understand human nature, honestly, rather than flattering it with false dignity, someone who showed that philosophy could be about actual human life, rather than abstract systems. He succeeded. The fat, jolly man who loved dinner parties and worried about his figure, who played backgammon when philosophy got too intense, who laughed at himself and refused to take his own skepticism to absurd lengths. That man changed how we think about thinking. Every time you hear someone say, correlation doesn't prove causation, that's Hume. Every time someone points out that we can't derive what ought to be from what is, that's Hume. Every time someone argues that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, that's the spirit of Hume's empiricism. Every time someone defends tolerance on the grounds that none of us has access to absolute truth, that's Hume's legacy. He's in the background of everything now. The assumptions we make about how to acquire knowledge, about what counts as evidence, about the relationship between reason and passion. These aren't natural assumptions. They're historical achievements, and Hume did more than almost anyone to establish them. But here's what makes Hume genuinely unusual. He was radical in his conclusions, but moderate in his temperament. He demolished traditional certainties, but didn't become a fanatic about their demolition. He showed that reason has limits, but didn't despise reason. He proved that morality can't be grounded in pure logic, but didn't conclude that morality is arbitrary. That combination is rare. Usually the skeptics are angry, the moderates are timid, the radicals are intolerant. Hume was skeptical without bitterness, radical without fanaticism, moderate without weakness. He took ideas seriously, but didn't take himself too seriously. Maybe that's why he remains relevant. Philosophical systems come and go. Grand theories rise and fall, but the questions Hume asked are permanent because they're questions about human nature itself. And human nature doesn't change. We're still the creatures he described, still drawing confident conclusions from limited evidence, still feeling moral sentiments we can't fully justify, still believing in causation even though we can't prove it exists, still acting as if we have free will even though we can't explain how that's possible. Hume didn't solve these puzzles, he made them clear, and sometimes clarity is more valuable than solutions. Because once you see the problem clearly, you stop wasting time on pseudo-solutions. You stop pretending you know things you don't know. You stop building elaborate theories on shaky foundations. That's liberating, not in a comfortable way. Hume's philosophy doesn't offer the warm reassurance of religious faith or the cold confidence of dogmatic rationalism. It offers something harder and more valuable, the freedom to think honestly. Which brings us full circle. Back to the young man in Edinburgh, reading philosophy and finding it disconnected from life, who decided to write something different, something that would show how human beings actually think and feel, something that would be honest even when honesty was uncomfortable. He did it. The treatise failed on publication but contained everything that mattered. The later book succeeded commercially but added little fundamentally new. The essays entertained and educated. The history made him famous and wealthy. But the real achievement was the vision, a way of understanding human nature that didn't flatter us with false dignity, but didn't reduce us to mere mechanism either. That recognized reason's power without exaggerating it. That took morality seriously without grounding it in superstition. That accepted uncertainty without falling into paralysis. This vision shaped the modern world more than most people realize. The scientific method rests on human skepticism about authority and emphasis on evidence. Liberal democracy reflects his tolerance and empiricism. Modern psychology acknowledges his insights about the relationship between reason and passion. Contemporary philosophy still wrestles with problems he identified. Not bad for a fat man who loved dinner parties. The history of philosophy is full of tortured geniuses and suffering saints. Hume was neither. He lived well, thought clearly, and died content. He didn't believe in immortal souls or divine judgment. He thought death was the end, and he faced it calmly. His last days were spent in good humour. Friends visited, he ate when he could. He joked about Charon, the ferryman of the dead in Greek mythology, who he imagined would be impatient for such a corpulent passenger. When asked if he wasn't afraid of what might come after death, he replied that it was as ridiculous to fear nothing as to hope for nothing. That's pure Hume, facing the ultimate unknown with humour and honesty. No desperate deathbed conversion, no final claims to certainty, just a consistent application of the principles he'd lived by. We don't know what happens after death, therefore we shouldn't pretend we do. Therefore we should focus on living well rather than dying well. He lived well, by his own standards and by most reasonable standards. He had friends who loved him. He wrote books that mattered. He thought clearly about difficult questions. He enjoyed food and conversation. He made people laugh. He contributed to human understanding. What more could you want? The grave on Calton Hill has no religious inscriptions because Hume didn't want them. His friends worried that omitting Christian symbols would cause trouble. Hume didn't care. He'd spent his life being honest. He wasn't going to stop at the end. The tomb was vandalised several times in the years after his death. Religious zealots offended by the infidel's monument. Eventually, the city put a fence around it. Now tourists visit, philosophers pay respects, students on Edinburgh walking tours stop to hear about the famous skeptic. Most of them probably haven't read the treatise. It's long and difficult, and not many people outside academic philosophy read it anymore. but they've absorbed its lessons anyway, through textbooks and summaries and the general intellectual atmosphere that Hume helped create. That's how ideas work. The original texts become historical artifacts, but the insights they contain, if they're genuine, seep into the culture, become part of how educated people think, get passed down in simplified form until nobody remembers where they came from. Hume would be fine with that. He didn't write for immortal fame. He wrote to understand human nature and to help others understand it. If people absorbed his insights without reading his books, that would be success, not failure. Though he'd probably prefer they read the books. He worked hard on them. The prose is careful. The arguments are subtle. The examples are well chosen. There's pleasure in reading Hume even when you disagree with him. The clarity, the wit, the honest grappling with difficult questions. Modern academic philosophy often lacks these qualities. Too much jargon, too much technical machinery, too little connection to actual human life. Hume would despise it. He'd say philosophy should be comprehensible to any intelligent reader willing to pay attention. That if you can't explain your ideas clearly, you probably don't understand them. He practiced what he preached. The treatise has difficult passages, sure, but it's never deliberately obscure. Every argument is laid out step by step. Every assumption is stated. Every objection is considered. You might not agree with the conclusions, but you'll never wonder what they are. That's respect for the reader, treating them as capable of following arguments and making up their own minds. Not hiding behind technical language or pretending to knowledge you don't have. Just saying what you think and why you think it, as clearly as possible. It's a model worth following. In philosophy and everywhere else, say what you mean. Admit what you don't know. Follow arguments wherever they lead. Don't pretend to certainties you don't have. Don't let passion override reason completely, but don't pretend reason can operate without passion either. These aren't revolutionary ideas anymore. They're common sense. But they weren't common sense in 1739. They became common sense partly because Hume argued for them so effectively. That's the ultimate success for a philosopher. Not to be quoted in perpetuity, but to change how people think so thoroughly that your ideas become obvious. To make what was controversial into what's taken for granted. Hume did that. The man who died 2.5 centuries ago shaped the assumptions you probably don't even realize you're making. About evidence and belief, about reason and emotion, about morality and self-interest, about what we can know and what we can't. He'd be pleased, not because he wanted fame, though he didn't mind it, but because he genuinely wanted to help people think more clearly. He thought confusion caused unnecessary conflict, that if people understood their own minds better, they'd be less dogmatic, more tolerant, better able to cooperate. Was he right? Partly. Understanding doesn't guarantee wisdom. Knowledge doesn't prevent stupidity, but it helps. And in a world full of competing certainties and absolute truths, Hume's modest skepticism remains valuable, maybe essential. The problems facing us now, climate change, political polarization, technological disruption, won't be solved by people who think they have all the answers. They'll be solved, if they're solved at all, by people who can think clearly about complex questions, who can admit uncertainty without paralysis, who can follow evidence even when it's uncomfortable. That's human thinking, not because Hume solved these specific problems. He couldn't have imagined them, but because he showed how to approach problems when you don't have certainty, when the evidence is incomplete, when different values conflict, when there's no obvious right answer. You do the best you can. You gather evidence. You think carefully. You consider objections. You make provisional judgments. You stay open to correction. You don't pretend to know more than you know. And you remember that other people, thinking just as carefully, might reach different conclusions. That's tolerance grounded in epistemology. We should tolerate disagreement not just because it's nice, but because none of us has access to absolute truth. We're all working with limited information, making fallible inferences, guided by sentiments we didn't choose. Given that, moderation and openness make sense. Fanaticism doesn't. The fanatic thinks he knows. The moderate knows he doesn't. Hume was the philosophical champion of moderation, not because he lacked strong convictions, he had plenty, but because he understood how difficult it is to be certain about anything important. And with that understanding, David Hume, the fat jolly man who loved his dinner and changed how we think, passes into history. Not solved, not finished, but present, in every careful argument, every honest doubt, every moment when someone admits they don't know and keeps thinking anyway. That's his monument. Not the tomb on Calton Hill, but the habits of thought he helped establish. The willingness to question, the insistence on evidence, the recognition that reason has limits but remains valuable, the understanding that we're human, all too human, but that understanding ourselves might help us live better. He died believing that, and the world he helped create suggests he was right. The study in Edinburgh where he died is gone now. The house was demolished long ago, but you can still visit his tomb in Calton Hill Cemetery. It's a simple Roman-style monument, circular, unadorned, no religious symbols, no quotes from his books, just his name and dates. Which is fitting. Hume didn't want to be remembered as a prophet or sage. He wanted to be remembered as someone who thought clearly and wrote well, someone who tried to understand human nature, honestly, rather than flattering it with false dignity. Someone who showed that philosophy could be about actual human life, rather than abstract systems. He succeeded. The fat, jolly man who loved dinner parties and worried about his figure, who played backgammon when philosophy got too intense, who laughed at himself and refused to take his own skepticism to absurd lengths. That man changed how we think about thinking. Every time you hear someone say, correlation doesn't prove causation, that's Hume. Every time someone points out that we can't derive what ought to be from what is, that's Hume. Every time someone argues that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, that's the spirit of Hume's empiricism. Every time someone defends tolerance on the grounds that none of us has access to absolute truth, that's Hume's legacy. He's in the background of everything now. The assumptions we make about how to acquire knowledge, about what counts as evidence, about the relationship between reason and passion. These aren't natural assumptions. They're historical achievements, and Hume did more than almost anyone to establish them. But here's what makes Hume genuinely unusual. He was radical in his conclusions, but moderate in his temperament. He demolished traditional certainties, but didn't become a fanatic about their demolition. He showed that reason has limits, but didn't despise reason. He proved that morality can't be grounded in pure logic, but didn't conclude that morality is arbitrary. That combination is rare. Usually the skeptics are angry, the moderates are timid, the radicals are intolerant. Hume was skeptical without bitterness, radical without fanaticism, moderate without weakness. He took ideas seriously, but didn't take himself too seriously. Maybe that's why he remains relevant. Philosophical systems come and go. Grand theories rise and fall. But the questions Hume asked are permanent, because they're questions about human nature itself. And human nature doesn't change. We're still the creatures he described, still drawing confident conclusions from limited evidence, still feeling moral sentiments we can't fully justify, still believing in causation even though we can't prove it exists, still acting as if we have free will even though we can't explain how that's possible. Hume didn't solve these puzzles. He made them clear, and sometimes clarity is more valuable than solutions. Because once you see the problem clearly, you stop wasting time on pseudo-solutions. You stop pretending you know things you don't know. You stop building elaborate theories on shaky foundations. That's liberating, not in a comfortable way. Hume's philosophy doesn't offer the warm reassurance of religious faith or the cold confidence of dogmatic rationalism. It offers something harder and more valuable, the freedom to think honestly, which brings us full circle. Back to the young man in Edinburgh reading philosophy and finding it disconnected from life, who decided to write something different, something that would show how human beings actually think and feel, something that would be honest even when honesty was uncomfortable. He did it. The treatise failed on publication but contained everything that mattered. The later books succeeded commercially but added little fundamentally new. The essays entertained and educated. The history made him famous and wealthy. But the real achievement was the vision, a way of understanding human nature that didn't flatter us with false dignity but didn't reduce us to mere mechanism either. That recognized reason's power without exaggerating it. That took morality seriously without grounding it in superstition. That accepted uncertainty without falling into paralysis. This vision shaped the modern world more than most people realize. The scientific method rests on human skepticism about authority and emphasis on evidence. Liberal democracy reflects his tolerance and empiricism. Modern psychology acknowledges his insights about the relationship between reason and passion. Contemporary philosophy still wrestles with problems he identified. Not bad for a fat man who loved dinner parties. The history of philosophy is full of tortured geniuses and suffering saints. Hume was neither. He lived well, thought clearly, and died content. He didn't believe in immortal souls or divine judgment. He thought death was the end, and he faced it calmly. His last days were spent in good humour. Friends visited, he ate when he could. He joked about Charon, the ferryman of the dead in Greek mythology, who he imagined would be impatient for such a corpulent passenger. When asked if he wasn't afraid of what might come after death, he replied that it was as ridiculous to fear nothing as to hope for nothing. That's pure Hume, facing the ultimate unknown with humour and honesty. No desperate deathbed conversion, no final claims to certainty, just a consistent application of the principles he'd lived by. We don't know what happens after death, therefore we shouldn't pretend we do. Therefore we should focus on living well rather than dying well. He lived well, by his own standards and by most reasonable standards. He had friends who loved him. He wrote books that mattered. He thought clearly about difficult questions. He enjoyed food and conversation. He made people laugh. He contributed to human understanding. What more could you want? The grave on Calton Hill has no religious inscriptions because Hume didn't want them. His friends worried that omitting Christian symbols would cause trouble. Hume didn't care. He'd spent his life being honest. He wasn't going to stop at the end. The tomb was vandalised several times in the years after his death. Religious zealots offended by the infidel's monument. Eventually the city put a fence around it. Now tourists visit, philosophers pay respects, students on Edinburgh walking tours stop to hear about the famous skeptic. Most of them probably haven't read the treatise. It's long and difficult, and not many people outside academic philosophy read it anymore. But they've absorbed its lessons anyway, through textbooks and summaries and the general intellectual atmosphere that Hume helped create. That's how ideas work. The original texts become historical artifacts, but the insights they contain, if they're genuine, seep into the culture, become part of how educated people think, get passed down in simplified form until nobody remembers where they came from. Hume would be fine with that. He didn't write for immortal fame. He wrote to understand human nature and to help others understand it. If people absorbed his insights without reading his books, that would be success, not failure. Though he'd probably prefer they read the books. He worked hard on them. The prose is careful, the arguments are subtle, the examples are well chosen. There's pleasure in reading Hume even when you disagree with him. The clarity, the wit, the honest grappling with difficult questions. Modern academic philosophy often lacks these qualities. Too much jargon, too much technical machinery, too little connection to actual human life. Hume would despise it. He'd say philosophy should be comprehensible to any intelligent reader willing to pay attention. That if you can't explain your ideas clearly, you probably don't understand them. He practiced what he preached. The treatise has difficult passages, sure, but it's never deliberately obscure. Every argument is laid out step by step. Every assumption is stated. Every objection is considered. You might not agree with the conclusions, but you'll never wonder what they are. That's respect for the reader, treating them as capable of following arguments and making up their own minds. Not hiding behind technical language or pretending to knowledge you don't have. Just saying what you think and why you think it as clearly as possible. It's a model worth following, in philosophy and everywhere else. Say what you mean, admit what you don't know, follow arguments wherever they lead. Don't pretend to certainties you don't have. Don't let passion override reason completely, but don't pretend reason can operate without passion either. These aren't revolutionary ideas anymore. They're common sense, but they weren't common sense in 1739. They became common sense partly because Hume argued for them so effectively. That's the ultimate success for a philosopher, not to be quoted in perpetuity, but to change how people think so thoroughly that your ideas become obvious, to make what was controversial into what's taken for granted. Hume did that. The man who died 2.5 centuries ago shaped the assumptions you probably don't even realize you're making about evidence and belief, about reason and emotion, about morality and self-interest, about what we can know and what we can't. He'd be pleased, not because he wanted fame, though he didn't mind it, but because he genuinely wanted to help people think more clearly. He thought confusion caused unnecessary conflict, that if people understood their own minds better, they'd be less dogmatic, more tolerant, better able to cooperate. Was he right? Partly. Understanding doesn't guarantee wisdom. Knowledge doesn't prevent stupidity, but it helps. And in a world full of competing certainties and absolute truths, Hume's modest skepticism remains valuable, maybe essential. The problems facing us now won't be solved by people who think they have all the answers. They'll be solved, if they're solved at all, by people who can think clearly about complex questions, who can admit uncertainty without paralysis, who can follow evidence even when it's uncomfortable. That's human thinking. Not because Hume solved these specific problems. He couldn't have imagined them, but because he showed how to approach problems when you don't have certainty. When the evidence is incomplete, when different values conflict, when there's no obvious right answer, you do the best you can. You gather evidence. You think carefully. You consider objections. You make provisional judgments. You stay open to correction. You don't pretend to know more than you know. And you remember that other people, thinking just as carefully, might reach different conclusions. That's tolerance grounded in epistemology. We should tolerate disagreement not just because it's nice, but because none of us has access to absolute truth. We're all working with limited information, making fallible inferences, guided by sentiments we didn't choose. Given that, moderation and openness make sense. Fanaticism doesn't. The fanatic thinks he knows. The moderate knows he doesn't. Hume was the philosophical champion of moderation, not because he lacked strong convictions, he had plenty, but because he understood how difficult it is to be certain about anything important. And with that understanding, David Hume, the fat, jolly man who loved his dinner and changed how we think, passes into history. Not solved, not finished, but present, in every careful argument, every honest doubt, every moment when someone admits they don't know and keeps thinking anyway. That's his monument, not the tomb on Calton Hill, but the habits of thought he helped establish, the willingness to question, the insistence on evidence, the recognition that reason has limits but remains valuable. The understanding that we're human, all too human, but that understanding ourselves might help us live better. He died believing that, and the world he helped create suggests he was right.